Well, I hope you've had a good day today. I hope you've had a good week so far. Maybe you've enjoyed the rain as much as I have. It's definitely been nice. It's cooled things down. So that's something to be thankful for. I know we have a couple of people that are sick and hurting, and we definitely want to remember those individuals. We want to pray for them, maybe reach out to them, let them know we're thinking of them, let them know that we love them. If you are sick and hurting or hurting in some type of way, and somebody in our church family doesn't know that, please reach out to somebody. Let them know. We want to be lifting your name up in prayer, if at all possible. We don't have any announcements tonight, so we can jump straight in to the book of Ecclesiastes. That's what we've been studying, right, so far. We are starting chapter 8 tonight. I think we can finish chapter 8, maybe. I've said that before, and sometimes that doesn't work out. But I think we can if I can quit talking and get into it. So let's not waste any more time. Ecclesiastes chapter 8. Remember, before we start this, chapter 7 was a rather odd chapter in the book of Ecclesiastes, right? Even the way it starts out with all these individual proverbs, and it's very hard to track the meaning of chapter 7. Kohelet makes a thought and then he says something else, and we wrestle with those two thoughts, and we're trying to figure out, what exactly is he trying to tell us? How does this thought relate to this thought? It seems, sometimes that there's 4 different thoughts and they don't relate to each other at all. So, it's a very difficult chapter to wrestle with. And at the end, we saw Kohelet say, he's searching for wisdom. Wisdom hasn't really been found, and what he does see, however, is the wickedness of humanity. That gets us into chapter 8. So if you haven't read chapter 8, pause the video, go read chapter 8, and then we will be ready to start. Chapter 8, verse 1. Who is like the wise? Now, before we discuss, we need to remember what Kohelet has said about wisdom so far. Well, he said a lot, so we probably don't remember everything he said about wisdom. But remember, he's on this quest that is driven by personal experience, and he wants to find the purpose of life. He wants to find some meaning, and he tries to find meaning in life in wisdom. But you might remember what he ultimately said about that. There are people that are, I guess we could say they're wiser than some, but they're not truly wise, because wise people, well, maybe I can illustrate this better. Think back to chapter 3. It's the famous chapter in the book of Ecclesiastes. There's a time for everything under the sun. Well, the wise person would know when the right time to perform an activity would be, right? That would be a characteristic of a wise person. The problem with that is Solomon says nobody, or I said Solomon, Kohelet. Whether you think Kohelet is Solomon or not, that's a debate for another time. Kohelet says the problem with there's a time and a place for everything is that humans don't know the right time to perform a certain action. And we get this feel throughout the book that individuals really aren't wise because wisdom can't be found. So who is like the wise? That's a rhetorical question. What's the answer to it? No one. No human being is like the wise. And who knows the interpretation of a thing? Well, this is difficult, right? If there's an interpretation of a thing, there might be possible choices, and if someone doesn't have wisdom, how are they to arrive at the right option? So I guess we could say maybe this is a bit sarcastic. Who is like the wise, and who knows the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the hardness of his face is changed. So notice what wisdom can do for a person. Wisdom can change the expression of their face. It can make a rather upset person happy. I say, verse 2, keep the king's command. Now, this is sort of, I think, where we kind of transition a bit. Kohelet is going to offer some advice. And notice what advice he offers. Keep the king's command. Well, okay, I guess that would probably generally be a good idea, to keep the king's command, right? You don't want to anger the person in authority. But exactly why, Kohelet, do you tell us to keep the king's command? Because of God's oath to him, or we could say because of his oath to God. Okay, what exactly is the image that Kohelet is trying to paint in our minds? Well, it seems what he's saying is possibly, keep the king's command, because you, as the subjects of the king, you took a vow to be loyal to the king. Don't be a fool. Don't break that vow. Now, do you remember what Kohelet has already said about vows, right? Kohelet has said, don't make a vow if you don't intend to keep it, right? In fact, it's better if you don't make a vow at all than to make a vow and not keep the vow. This kind of gets into the idea of let your words be few. Serve the king. You've made a vow to God. Keep the king's commands. Hear his instructions and obey them. But notice what is said now in verse 3. Be not hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand in an evil cause, for he does whatever he pleases. Now, this verse is a bit difficult to, I guess, try to grasp the meaning of what is said here in verse 3. On the one hand, if we take this be not hasty to go to be a part of verse 3, well, we kind of have to scratch our heads a little bit, because notice exactly what is said. Be not hasty to go from his presence. In other words, don't be itching to leave the presence of the king. Do not take a stand in an evil cause. So it seems the idea is, if you have an idea or you have some advice to offer the king maybe, and you go to the king, and he rejects that advice or he rejects that idea, he doesn't plan to implement that idea, don't stand in an evil cause. Don't keep trying to further that idea if the king has shot it down, I guess. So what should a person do if they come to the king and they offer the king some advice or offer an idea and the king rejects it? Well, they're not supposed to keep pushing, so they're supposed to drop it. But what was said at the beginning of the verse? Do not be hasty to go from his presence. Well, something doesn't seem to add up. So what some people have done is actually say, well, the phrase be not hasty to go actually belongs, or be not hasty to, rather. The phrase be not hasty to actually belongs in verse 2 and doesn't belong in verse 3. I guess, we could hash that out maybe, but, either way, I guess we could make it fit. But I do want us to note this evil cause. Well, what exactly do we have in mind here? Is it like we just talked about, that you have this idea that the king rejects or some advice that he rejects and you want to, continue to push? Or is this like full out political rebellion? What is in mind here? That's something else we might need to consider. Nevertheless, notice why you aren't to keep pushing or rebel if you want to go that route. For he does what he pleases. Notice the power of the king, the man in a position of authority that is in charge of all his subjects, in charge of all the land. Do what he says, because he is the guy with the power. When his mind is made up, his mind is made up. Don't try to change it. Don't try to resist. Just go with him. Because whatever he wants, that's what he's going to get. Well, okay, verse 4. For the word of the king is supreme. Again, notice the power of the king. What he says goes. And who may say to him, what are you doing? In other words, who is, a person in the king's court to go to the king and say to the king, what are you doing? Why are you making the decisions that you're making? Nobody has that power, right? The king is the one in a position of power, not the individuals that reside in his court. So nobody's going to stop the king. Now, what's interesting is we go back to the book of Job and we look in chapter 9. Job sort of talks about this same idea, but instead of using it to refer to the king, he uses the same idea to relate to God. In other words, nobody can argue with God. God is supreme and nobody is going to stop him. Nobody can stop him because he is all powerful. What is the idea? Is Kohelet mooching off that idea and trying to get us to understand the king as if he is God and nobody can stop him? I'm not sure. Either way, we learn that the king is the man in charge, the man with ultimate authority. Well, notice verse 5. Whoever keeps a command will know no evil thing. In other words, you should keep the king's commands. Why? Because you will be better off for it. It's when you resist, it's when you keep going after the king has said no, that things can become dangerous, that your life can sort of unravel. If you want to keep yourself whole and keep yourself safe, just do what the king says. So whoever keeps a command will know no evil thing. Now, evil, again, let's discuss this. We've talked about it before. The word evil in the Old Testament has a very broad semantic range, okay? When we think of evil, we think of pretty much moral evil. But this evil can actually refer to things that are just bad. It's a bad situation, not necessarily morally bad. It's just not in your favor. That's an evil thing, or that can be an example of an evil thing. But notice the end of verse 5. And the wise in heart will know the proper time and the just way. Well, if we go with what we read already in chapter 3, that is true. True wisdom knows the proper time to perform a specific action. The problem is humans do not have that wisdom. Verse 6, for there is a time and a way for everything, although man's trouble lies heavy on him. Now, what exactly is man's trouble? Is man's trouble the reality that human beings don't possess the knowledge to know when it is truly the right time to do something? Is that what lays heavy on man? Or is it the fact that, they can't ever be sure of the right time to go to the king and offer some advice or an idea? What is it? Well, again, this is just one of the difficult verses. Verse 7, for he does not know what is to be, for who can tell him how it will be? Well, here's the problem. What's a wise person? A wise person knows the choice to make in a specific situation, right? Well, in order to know the right choice to make in a specific situation, one would at least have to be aware of future results if they chose the other option, right? Well, what's the problem? Man is incapable of knowing the future at all. So if a person can't know the future, then they can't be wise. You see, these ideas tend to build on themselves. Verse 8, no man has power to retain the Spirit. Well, what is this? Is this talking about like the breath of life? You know, the word for spirit can also be translated wind. It seems, because we talk about death next, that breath of life probably isn't the best translation of that word, so we probably need to go with wind. We'll notice that man does not have power or control over the wind. Kohelet says a lot of times that he gives an illustration of something, and he said, that's like grasping after the wind. It can't be done. It's useless. Nobody can grab and contain the wind. Human beings don't have power over the wind. The wind blows whenever it wants to blow, and it blows in the direction that it wants to blow. But notice what is said next, or power over the day of death. Human beings know that they're going to die, but they do not know when they are going to die or how they are going to die. They have no control over death. It is going to happen to everyone at some point in time. Humans can't stop it. There is no discharge from war. Well, notice we have this big event here. One man doesn't seem to be able to do a whole lot. Nor will wickedness deliver those who are given to it. We get the sense that man is really powerless. Sure, people are in positions of power, but at the end of the day, we don't really have power. Verse 9, all this I observed. Notice again, his quest is driven by personal experience, not by some special revelation, not by the words of some other individual. This is personal experience, what he's seen, what he's experienced himself. All this I observed while applying my heart to all that is done under the sun, when man had power over man to his hurt. Well, already this has been pretty intense, right? Let's go down to verse 10. Then I saw the wicked buried. They used to go in and out of the holy place and were praised in the city where they had done such things. This also is vanity. Verse 11, because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily, the heart of the children of man is fully set to do evil. Though a sinner does evil 100 times and prolongs his life, yet I know that it will be well with those who fear God, because they fear before him. But it will not be well with the wicked, neither will he prolong his days like a shadow, because he does not fear before God. Here we go. We're back to what we talked about in the book of Job. We're back to the idea of the doctrine of retribution. Does Kohelet uphold the doctrine of retribution, or does he have disagreements? That's probably a great place to stop so we don't chop up that thought into multiple pieces. We will jump into chapter 8 again next week. I know I said we'd finish, but we just can't. There's too much to talk about. So we'll get back to it next week, Lord willing. I hope to see everybody Sunday. God bless.